There was a decade when a single spray could announce exactly who you were before you said a word. The 80s didn't do subtlety. Power dressing, power lunches, power everything, and the fragrances men wore matched that energy exactly. Bold, animalic, unapologetically loud. These weren't scents you wore to blend in. They were worn specifically to be remembered. And then, one by one, almost every single one of them got quietly taken apart. Not discontinued, not pulled from shelves, something arguably worse. They stayed on the market, kept the same name, kept the same bottle, and slowly over years of reformulation stopped being the fragrance that made them famous in the first place. Today, we're covering 5 of the defining scents of a generation, what actually made each one so powerful in the first place, and exactly what happened to quietly gut them from the inside out. Before we get into it, here's the pattern worth understanding, because it's going to repeat across all 5 of these stories in slightly different forms. Fragrance regulation changed dramatically over the decades following the 80s. International bodies began restricting or banning ingredients once considered completely standard, some for genuine safety reasons, others simply out of caution. At the same time, rising material costs pushed companies toward cheaper synthetic substitutes for ingredients that used to be genuinely rare and expensive. Individually, either of those forces might have been survivable. Combined, they quietly reshaped an entire era of fragrance, often without most casual wearers even noticing the difference happened at all. The people who did notice were the ones who'd worn the originals for years. And what they noticed, again and again, was the same thing. Something was missing. Let's start with a deep cut most casual buyers never even discovered. Released in 1982, Quorum built its entire identity on dense tobacco and dark leather wrapped in resinous warmth. Something genuinely heavy and confident at a time when boldness was the whole point of wearing cologne. It was massive in its first years, worn by men who wanted something with real weight behind it. Then reformulation started chipping away at the exact materials that gave it that density. The tobacco note thinned, the leather lost its rawness, and at points the fragrance nearly disappeared from shelves entirely as brands quietly deprioritized it. What survived carries the name and the general shape, but longtime wearers describe it as a pale outline of the original, missing the depth that made it worth seeking out in the first place. It never reached the household recognition of the others on this list, but collectors specifically hunt early 80s batches because they know exactly what got lost along the way. Launched in 1981, Antaeus was Chanel's answer to the animalic, unapologetically primal fragrances defining the decade. Built around castoreum, civet, and a thick base of oak moss, it had a genuinely dirty, skin-like quality that made it feel less like cologne and more like a second skin. Those exact materials became targets of increasing restriction over the following decades, the same regulatory wave that hit civet-based fragrances across the entire industry. Antaeus was reformulated repeatedly to comply, and each version pulled further from that raw, confrontational character. What remains today is recognizable as Antaeus in name and structure, but wearers who remember the original consistently describe the current version as clean, tame, and stripped of the animalic edge that made it dangerous to wear in the first place. It's one of the most frequently cited examples in fragrance circles of a house classic losing exactly the quality that made it a classic. Kouros arrived in 1981 as one of the most animalic fragrances ever released by a major house, built around civet, a genuinely primal, skin-like note that gave the entire composition an unmistakable, almost confrontational sensuality. This wasn't a fragrance designed to be liked by everyone. It was designed to be unforgettable to the people who did. Civet, along with several other animalic materials common in fragrances of that era, became increasingly restricted over the following decades, both for regulatory reasons and shifting cost considerations. Kouros was reformulated repeatedly to comply, and each version pulled further away from that original raw intensity. What's left today is recognizable as Kouros in name and general shape, but wearers who remember the original describe the current version as a noticeably tamer echo of a fragrance once considered genuinely bold to the point of controversy. It remains one of the most frequently cited examples in fragrance circles of an iconic scent losing the exact quality that made it iconic in the first place. Z14 never reached the same mainstream household recognition as the others on this list, but among the people who actually wore it, it built something closer to genuine devotion. Released in the mid-70s and defining much of the decade that followed, it combined leather, oak moss, and dense woody notes into something dark, confident, and unmistakably different from anything else on the shelf at the time. Oak moss, in particular, became subject to significant regulatory restriction over the following decades due to potential skin sensitivity concerns, and it happened to be one of the defining structural elements of Z14's entire character. Reformulation stripped much of that depth out entirely, and unlike some of the other names on this list, Z14 largely faded from mainstream shelves as its cult following aged out, without a comparable new generation of wearers discovering it fresh. Today it survives mostly in second-hand vintage bottles, sought out specifically by collectors chasing pre-reformulation batches, which tells you plainly that the people who actually remember the original know exactly what was lost. And we are closing the fragrance many consider the original template for the entire power suit era, releasing all the way back in 1964, and defining decades of boardroom masculinity that followed it. Aramis built its identity on a dense, leathery Scheiper structure, genuinely complex and unmistakably confident, the kind of fragrance that signaled authority the moment someone walked into a room. Across decades of reformulation, driven by both changing regulations and shifting production costs, that density was gradually thinned out. Long-term wearers consistently describe later production batches as noticeably lighter and less textured than the versions that defined the fragrance's reputation in the first place. What makes Aramis's storyline differently than the others is simply how long it lasted before any of this happened. 2 decades of defining an entire category before the slow erosion even began. That's a genuinely rare run, and it's exactly why so many people still consider it the true original, even after everything that came afterward changed around it. So here's what actually connects all 5 of these stories, spread across nearly 2 decades of releases, and several more decades of quiet change happening to every single one of them. None of these fragrances disappeared. That's what makes this different from a story about brands collapsing entirely. These scents are still sitting on shelves right now, still wearing the same names, still recognizable enough that most casual buyers walk right past the difference without ever noticing anything changed at all. The people who do notice are the ones who actually remember what came before, and for them, wearing the current version can feel less like nostalgia and more like meeting an old friend who's become someone slightly different without ever announcing the change. That's really the quiet lesson sitting inside every one of these stories. Sometimes the thing you loved doesn't get taken away from you all at once. Sometimes it just gets slowly reshaped around you, one small adjustment at a time, until one day you're holding the same bottle, spraying the same name, and it simply isn't the same thing anymore. If this made you want to go dig through your own collection, or maybe track down a vintage bottle of something you used to wear, that's exactly the kind of history I like digging into on this channel. Subscribe if you want more of these honest, overlooked fragrance stories. And tell me in the comments, did you ever wear the original version of any of these 5, and did you notice when it changed?